What is going on, YouTube? Andrew Miller and Shane Black from hook'emheadlines.com. We're coming back at you on a busy recording night for us. We are doing the second video in the NFL Draft Scouting Report series for the Texas Longhorns, the 2023 class. First one we did Texas linebacker DeMarvion Overshown. We are now doing Texas running back Roschon Johnson. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into it. So Roschon, I mean, his recruitment was really interesting. He's, for anyone that doesn't know, he was originally recruited as a four-star dual threat quarterback out of Port Neches Groves in Texas. He was part of the 2019 class, recruited under former head coach Tom Herman. He was kind of, I don't know if he was necessarily viewed as like the next in line to be a starting quarterback, but definitely a guy that was going to contend for the starting job. At least that was what I thought for him coming out of high school. But he ended up ultimately being converted to a running back before his true freshman season. He has a lot of the tools to be able to succeed there, as we've seen over the last 4 years. Shane, I don't know how much you covered him coming out of high school, but what were some of your first thoughts on him when he first arrived at Texas?
Yeah, I was excited. I've been more of a guy who likes the dual threat quarterback, especially watching high school film. It's just more fun to watch. It's almost like a video game character, and that's kind of what his film looked like. But I think it's important to know that he was moved over to running back as a freshman out of necessity because Texas was seeing early in the season a lot of injuries at that position. And so Tom Herman moved Roschon there out of necessity, and he never looked back because of how well he played. And I think he kind of realized if he wanted to play at the next level in the NFL, that this was going to be his path, and he kind of embraced that. So he can do a lot of things, and I think he's going to be a guy that's going to be on an NFL roster, contributing in multiple ways for up to a decade.
Yeah, you could really see in the last few years the way his game developed that he had next level potential, and that ultimately a lot of the experience, a lot of the tools that he built, as a quarterback coming out of high school, is what will serve him so well as an NFL draft prospect. But and we'll get into that here throughout the video. I mentioned what are your first impressions on him when he arrived at Texas, because his most productive season was, just in terms of like total yards, was during his true freshman campaign. He ended up with a little over 800 yards from scrimmage, 8 total touchdowns, about 650 rushing yards, and 7 rushing touchdowns as a true freshman. At the time, he was splitting carries with Keontae Ingram, who is now, I believe, with the Arizona Cardinals. Am I correct on that? Yeah. A guy who also eventually transferred to USC following the 2020 season. Roschon was a guy that was never really the guy in the backfield, but he was always such a critical component of the two deep, and especially with a guy like Keontae, he was such a good change of pace. Whereas with Bijan, Bijan is a better running back. He was the best, in my opinion, the best running back in the country this past season. But Roschon, that's no discrediting him, because I think he was probably a top 20 running back, at least in the Power 5. It just so happened that he wasn't starting in the backfield for Texas in the last few seasons. So, he had really, I guess, if I'm zooming out here to his entire career at Texas, he was really steady. He showed a lot of maturity in his game right away. I mentioned that in terms of total production, his true freshman campaign was his best. But if you're looking at efficiency, blocking ability, also making people miss in the open field as a receiver, and just his, one of the things that I really liked in terms of his year-over-year progression was he was finding different ways to make people miss in the open field. I think you saw the most highlights coming from him this past season in that regard. But if you look at his physical tools, because he's about 6'2", 230 pounds. 6'2", 225, 230, around that frame. He's a guy that just was a menacing pass blocker. And whether it's picking up a blitz, if it's, having to maybe read a delayed blitz or, pick someone up off the edge. I never really saw him shy away from a block. And he's always very smart with how he moved within the pocket to be able to protect the quarterback. Run blocking, I have more questions about, but we'll get into that a little bit later. What were some of your perspectives on him during his time in Texas?
I think in general, like one of those things you can't measure is he's just a great locker room guy. Every year, I mean, we saw it in year one when he was thrusted into the running back role and seemingly, turned into one of the better running backs in the Power Five. But every single year, I mean, he's voted team captain and he's beloved by his teammates. So he's not going to be a guy. He certainly has no ego. You mentioned it, how his freshman season was his most productive in terms of carries and yards. Then a guy named Bijan Robinson came into the mix. And instead of transferring or, complaining about carries, Roschon just embraced his role and really bought into the idea of this was going to be a two-headed system. I think that really speaks to him as a team player because looking to the next level, I don't think he's, really like going to be a 3-down back kind of guy. So we already know that he can embrace that kind of running back by committee system, but going to make a difference on special teams more, many of times, even as a senior last year. He's running down there, the first guy down there on kick coverage, making big plays. So when you draft this guy, I think he's going to be a great addition, not only to the running back room, but he's going to be a special team standout. And he's a guy who, like I said, doesn't really care what role he's in. He's going to do it well.
The next thing I was going to talk about were some of his intangibles. Yeah, I mean, the leadership in terms of intangibles is just one of the things that sticks out. He's a team guy. He's going to do whatever it takes to be able to get his team in a place to be successful and to be a winning club. That sort of positive locker room presence and mentality is something he definitely brings to the table. Versatility, and I guess some of the finer points of his game that aren't necessarily like the biggest points of appeal or again the most often talked about, but you mentioned speed. This is one thing I will address when we get into strengths and weaknesses more, but he is a guy that was very elusive in the open field in his last few years at Texas, whether that be the receiving game, the ground game. I think he was somewhere in the ballpark of like 50 missed tackles forced just on the ground, which ranked in the not the upper 90th percentile, but within the 90th percentile of the Power Five among running backs. Yards after contact, he had more than 400. If you consider the fact that he only had 545 rushing yards this past season, that's pretty insane. That just means that he's bowling through people like it's no one's business. And statistically too, I think when I look at the reliability factor here, he had one fumble during his 4 years at Texas. That should say something. So let's hop into his strengths. This is probably my favorite part of the video when talking about Roschon because it's so easy to gush about him. We mentioned some of those at Texas, but if I'm just looking at his profile for the NFL draft, I think that the first thing that's going to come to the surface is his downhill ability as a rusher. I would say mostly in zone run plays. That was most of his usage at Texas, and I think that's where most of his value will lie at the next level. But there are different ways you can utilize him. You mentioned I don't think he's going to be an every down back at the NFL level, but more than likely he's going to be a good change of pace guy from a physicality perspective. I've mentioned it time and time again. He can definitely handle running between the tackles, running over some guys. At 6'2", 225, 230, and I would imagine maybe putting on some weight before heading to the NFL. That from a frame and a muscle mass perspective, he's going to look the part. But other than 40 time, I think that's where his stock can ultimately rise. Because lateral movement, he definitely improved that. Even coming out of high school, his 20-yard shuttle time, 4.29, which was among the better running backs in his class. I do remember covering him coming out of high school. The lateral agility is definitely something that's there. It was one of the reasons why he was such a potent dual threat quarterback. But yeah, yeah, as a rusher, what are some of your thoughts on him?
Yeah, he did well at letting the play develop in front of him. He's not trying to force things, kind of let his blockers work. And then when there is any sliver of a crease, he's pretty adept at hitting that hole. And I said earlier that I think I was a little high on what I think he's going to run. It's probably going to be more in the 4.5, 4.6 range, but his ability to explode through small openings is kind of where you see that speed and burst come into play. Where if it's just a foot race with a defensive back, someone might catch up to him, but in small spaces, he's great at hitting the hole. You never really seeing negative plays with Rojo. He's pretty adept at falling forward. He kind of neutralizes any sort of 5-yard losses and makes most of that diving back to the line of scrimmage. So super high IQ guy and he kind of knows what everyone else on the offense is supposed to be doing, not only his role, which I think is pretty important at the next level to have a larger grasp of the offensive system. So yeah, as a runner, I think he's not a guy you give the ball 25 times a game, but he gets 10 to 12 touches and he can be really effective. I mean, we saw at Texas during his senior year average 6 yards a rush and I think like 8 yards a catch. So getting him the ball in space, he makes people miss. Very rarely does he get taken down by the first guy.
The way that he was able to see the field and understand kind of different defensive maneuvers and the different way that defenders were going to move, and I think that is a little bit of the quarterback in him, kind of is what makes him, or at least at Texas, what made him a next level running back. And that's where I'm getting into the next strength here, is his ability to see different gaps open, or see different, I wouldn't say necessarily different gaps open up, but his ability to fight through chaos and run between the tackles. That field vision, more specifically to Roschon, the way that he's able to see the field, like you mentioned, helps him avoid negative plays. It helps him pick up chunk plays, helps him know where he's ultimately going to be the most efficient. He was mostly used in zone run plays at Texas. That was about 70 to 75% of his usage on the ground. So running between the gaps isn't necessarily going to be the most natural fit for him at the next level. But those zone run plays, when he was used in a kind of a larger workload situation, especially in 2022, he was really effective. The only 3 games during the 2022 season where he had double-digit carries, he averaged 5.9, 7.4, and 6.5 yards per carry. Every single game over 70 rushing yards. And so, again, that consistency, that ability to just make the most out of every play, I mean, that's such a valuable thing in this day and age in the NFL where, teams are looking for guys that can pick you up 4, 5, 10, whatever yards that is, things that constitute successful plays, instead of just always having that home run threat. The other part of this that I wanted to mention among his strengths is really his explosiveness once he finds a lane. Again, I don't know if this is old data. I don't know if this is just people looking at other people's scouting reports or just seeing an old 40 time and saying, oh, Roschon ran a 4.7 or a 4.8 40 time coming out of high school. He's not a home run threat. I would counter that. He had a breakaway run percentage at Texas this past season of around 40%. What that means is 40% of his, I believe it was 40% of his touches on the ground went for 15 yards or more. And so that ranked among the top 10 backs, or top 10 eligible backs in the Big 12. I think it was actually among the top 7. That's ahead of guys, if you want to look at like Oklahoma State, like Ollie Gordon, an explosive back there, Marcus Major, Javante Barnes, Eric Gray from OU, ranked ahead of all those guys. I believe it even ranked ahead of Bijan. And so he's a guy that had a lot of big runs at Texas. Again, explosiveness is not like a major strength of his by any means, but I think it's an overlooked strength is what I would categorize that as. Those are like kind of the 2 things I think in terms of his ability to see the field and really just make the most out of every play as a runner and just be a consistently capable running back out of the backfield are the 2 things that stick out to me the most. But like when you think of his like just overall power as a running back and his strength, I mean, how would you characterize that as a strength for him?
Yeah, I think his power is often overlooked just because he's not compared to, but running next to Bijan, who is just a freak, absolute specimen. But Roschon has a very strong base. And I mean, we mentioned it doesn't get brought down easily. He keeps the legs churning. He's going to fall forward. He's probably going to be a solid short yardage back in the NFL. Like he's not. That's not going to be his only role, but he's going to be a guy that can pick you up the tough yards.
But yeah, I mean, he's someone that can multiple ways too. It's not he can stiff arm you. He can just straight up just put his head down, run you over, get a shoulder into you. He's not just someone that can be elusive with kind of make you miss with some lateral movement there. He's someone that will run you over as well. There's a few other minor things I have here for his strengths. Is there anything else that you wanted to note?
No, not particularly. I think as you notice, and you'll probably see how the video on the weaknesses tails off a little bit. Roschon's more of a, kind of master of all, or what's the phrase? He's a jack of all trades, master of none. He does everything pretty well. Like there's not anything there are some things we can nitpick, and we're going to get into that about his game, but pretty much whatever you need him to do, he can do. But so you might be sitting here watching the video. Why isn't he a first or second round back? He doesn't really have any of those elite traits that a guy like Bijan, Jahmyr Gibbs, or like an A-Chain does. But he does everything pretty well. So I think you can go through it and if you're going plus minus on different characteristics, he's going to be a plus at a lot of them. But
now we can look at some of the areas of improvement for him, and I like this because I don't have a ton unless I'm getting real nitpicky. My thing with his areas of improvement that I think would be the biggest thing to note is kind of the lack of separation in the running game and the receiving game. I mentioned that when he hits a hole and he goes off for a big play, it's mostly because he's able to see the field so well, and that he's able to make defenders miss, whether that's running someone over or shaking them in the open field. But just in terms of, again, the straight line speed, it's not great. It's Bijan isn't even a guy that's got a ton of straight line speed. You mentioned A-Chain as a good example of a guy that's just going to be able to run past people, but Roschon, that's not really his thing. And that in terms of his route running, while he is a pretty good technical route runner out of the backfield and has a few different routes he can run, the separation I don't know if that's ever going to be there, especially at the NFL level.
Yeah, I think the one major weakness for me is kind of pass catching. I mean, you look at the basic bones of his numbers. Like you go to his Football Reference and you say, oh, this guy caught 56 balls for 420 yards. He's a pretty solid pass catcher. That's more on like kind of check down stuff, set up screens. Like you mentioned, he has a couple different route concepts that he can run, but he's not a guy that's going to be pushing down the field. He's not going more than 10 yards down the field and proven to be an effective receiver. So he's more of kind of like a check and release type guy, which isn't really necessarily a bad thing because we mentioned that he's not afraid to stick his nose in pass blocking. So it's kind of perfect, stick your nose in and then check and release. But when he does get the ball in his hands, that's where he becomes effective. Just don't expect him to be making any like spectacular catches down the field. But that's kind of one of my main critique against him.
I did want to mention his hands aren't great, especially once he gets in front of the line of scrimmage and has to run any sort of structured route. He had 5 catches in front of the line of scrimmage and 2 drops. So that's not ever what you want. That's a similar trend to the way he went year over year at Texas. One of the things I should have highlighted a little bit before is he's actually a really good outlet out of the backfield. Again, it's just that field vision. So that's one thing to note. Definitely, I'll include that on the strengths as well. But yeah, I mean, he's just not going to pose much of a threat in terms of his ability. Whether it's 2 yards or 10 yards down the field, it would have to be pretty simple concepts to the flats out of the backfield for him to be a legitimate chunk yardage play threat. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good point. My next thing, and really the last that I was going to mention just in terms of like any sort of significant area of improvement, would be as a run blocker. He he's a better in terms of just his like ability, like raw ability as a blocker and what he showed at Texas. He was a higher graded pass blocker in the last few years, and it just on film he looked more natural as a pass blocker. I don't know if that was necessarily just because of his feel as a quarterback and his physicality, like that just translated well as a pass blocker in the backfield, or if just maybe he just doesn't have enough experience as a run blocker yet. Because I believe if you look at his workload, he started to get utilized a lot more as a run blocker the last couple of years because you had more two-back sets at Texas, especially with Bijan involved. Yeah, career high 48 run blocking snaps this past season. I guess it's not the most natural thing for him, but again, technique, pad level, all of those need some tweaks. I think it's an area that he can definitely still be proficient in at the NFL level. In terms of his grades, he was trending up throughout the 2022 season as a run blocker. But I mean that's going to be a weak note if he's going to be in a number of two-back sets, or even if he's going to be blocking for a dual threat quarterback that's going to be running on some design run plays. I think this is a good transition point though for projections. I think this is fun with Rojo because it's nice to be in a spot where Texas has potentially two running backs that are going by the end of day 2 in the NFL draft between Bijan and Roschon. I personally think that he is going to end up going as a late day 2 pick, but how I would expect, given he ran a 4.8 at the Elite 11, I believe it was the opening. Yeah, I think that was at an opening regional combine in 2018. I don't know how much he's added. I would expect a 4.6 or a 4.7. I'll be interested to see the pro day numbers, but I think he'll test well in other areas, but that will do enough to just kind of float his draft stock, maybe not necessarily improve it.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with you. I'd probably lean a little more to early day 3 instead of late day 2, just because of how deep this running back class is. And typically in the first couple of rounds, we see teams like to take more home run swings. Whereas Rojo, you're probably not getting an all-pro running back here. But what I think will help him and what's going to keep him in that like 4th round instead of falling a little bit is kind of what you're getting. His floor is very high to themselves. Well, we know Roschon's a great locker room guy and he's a great special teams guy. So, at least in year 1 and 2, he can come in and provide that energy in those areas. But yeah, ultimately, we've said it multiple times. I think the interview process is going to help him out. Teams are going to fall in love with him. And yeah, I think wherever he ends up, or if you're watching this after your team has taken him, he might not be an immediate impact offensive player in year 1, but he's certainly going to provide a lot of value to your team. And I think he's going to be a guy that lasts around the NFL longer than a lot of other running backs, just because he has a longer shelf life with what he's able to do on both the offensive side and special teams side of the football.
Okay. Well, for Andrew Miller, Shane Black at Hook'emHeadlines.com, that's pretty much it for this Rojo video. Hook 'em.